The summer heat pressed down on East Briarwood like an invisible hand, squeezing the air from the streets. Cracks ran along the sidewalks like scars on forgotten skin, and the brick buildings sagged with the weight of years of neglect. Marlene Johnson walked carefully, one step at a time, balancing a paper grocery bag against her hip. Her dress, bright yellow with little blue flowers, billowed gently around her legs. Her skin, rich and dark, shimmered with sweat under the merciless sun, yet she held her head high, as she always had, with the quiet dignity of a woman who had survived decades of broken promises. Inside the bag, bread, milk, a carton of eggs, some oranges, a box of oatmeal, humble things, but hard won. The grocery store had not been welcoming. They never were. The cashier, a young white man with buzzed hair and suspicious eyes, had scanned her items as if each one was a burden. He hadn't said a word until the total flashed on the screen. No hello, no thank you, only a grunt. Marlene had smiled anyway. She had learned long ago that her smile could disarm suspicion better than any words. But it hadn't stopped the two security guards from following her out, their walkie-talkies crackling with coded suspicion. Now, only 2 blocks from home, Marlene let herself breathe a little easier. The old brownstone where she lived stood just ahead, behind a rusting fence and a weeping willow tree. She never heard the police cars coming. They appeared as if summoned by the air itself, 2 black and white cruisers sliding to a halt in front of her, doors flung open, guns drawn. "Put your hands where we can see them," an officer shouted, voice sharp and full of fear. Marlene froze. The grocery bag tilted dangerously, but she caught it, clutching it to her chest like a shield. I live right there," she said, voice trembling. She pointed toward her home. "Drop the bag," barked another officer, stepping closer. His hands shook slightly on the grip of his pistol. "But, it's just food," Marlene whispered. The world around her slowed. She saw a mother dragging her child behind a dumpster. She saw a man peeking through his blinds, foam pressed to his ear. She saw fear everywhere. But none of it saved her. Bang! The gunshot tore through the heavy air. Marlene's body jerked backward, the brown bag exploding open, a carton of milk bursting like a popped balloon. She crumpled to the pavement, face twisted in pain, groceries rolling across the street, a loaf of bread soaking up a widening pool of blood. The officers rushed forward, shouting commands she could no longer hear. One of them kicked the grocery bag aside, weapon still trained on her frail, motionless body. She wanted to cry out, to tell them she was not their enemy. She wanted to scream her son's name. But darkness swallowed her whole. Far across the state, deep inside a secure military facility, Commander Elijah Johnson wiped the sweat from his brow and dismissed his Delta Force team for a short break. His phone buzzed on the table, a number he didn't recognize. Frowning, he answered. "Is this Commander Elijah Johnson?" a strained voice asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Mercy General Hospital. Your mother. She's been shot. She's critical." For a moment, Elijah didn't understand. His mind, trained to process threats and combat scenarios, couldn't compute this simple fact. Marlene Johnson, the woman who had nursed his wounds, braided his hair as a boy, and kissed him goodbye when he left for Afghanistan, was lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. Without another word, he sprinted out the door. The battlefield had come home. And this time, Elijah wasn't just fighting for strangers in a foreign desert. This time, he was fighting for his mother. The wheels of Elijah Johnson's black SUV shrieked as he took a corner at 40 miles an hour, racing toward Mercy General Hospital. His heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum. He could still hear the nurse's voice in his mind, clipped, rushed, urgent, critical condition, gunshot wound, police incident. None of it made sense. How could it be? His mother, Marlene, the woman who had survived segregation, poverty, redlined neighborhoods and underfunded schools, shot by those who were sworn to protect? His hands tightened on the steering wheel until the leather creaked. All his years in the military had taught him one truth: hesitation kills. He would not hesitate now. As he approached the hospital, he could already see the cluster of police vehicles outside. Their flashing lights painted the gray walls with harsh strokes of blue and red. News vans had started to gather too, buzzing like vultures around a fresh corpse. Inside the emergency room, chaos reigned. Doctors in scrubs ran past, pushing stretchers and shouting codes Elijah didn't fully understand. The smell of blood, antiseptic, and fear filled the air. Elijah stormed to the reception desk. "My mother, Marlene Johnson, where is she?" The woman behind the counter barely looked up, Family members have to wait. He slammed his military ID onto the desk. The Delta Force insignia, the symbol of America's most elite warriors, glinted under the fluorescent lights. I'm not waiting, Elijah growled. The woman paled. She picked up the phone immediately, murmured into it, then motioned to a nurse. Within seconds, Elijah was led through the swinging doors into the heart of the trauma ward. Marlene lay on a gurney, surrounded by a sea of white coats and machines that beeped frantically. Blood seeped through bandages wrapped tightly around her hip and abdomen. Her face, once full of fire and warmth, looked impossibly small under the harsh hospital lights. She's lost a lot of blood, a doctor explained, voice clipped. We had to remove fragments of the bullet from her pelvic bone. There's internal damage, but she's stable for now. For now. 2 words that sliced through Elijah's soul like a knife. He reached out, his battle-hardened fingers trembling, and touched his mother's hand. It was cold. Too cold. You hang on, Mama, he whispered. I'm here. I'm not leaving you. Behind him, a pair of officers in pressed uniforms waited. They approached cautiously, like men walking toward a live grenade. Sir, one said, we need to ask you a few questions regarding your mother's involvement in today's incident. Elijah turned slowly, his muscles coiled tight with barely restrained fury. Involvement? He repeated, voice dangerously low. You shot an unarmed woman carrying groceries, and you call that involvement? The officer shifted uncomfortably. There was a report of a robbery suspect in the area, he said. The description. Let me guess. Elijah interrupted, stepping closer. Black, breathing, existing. Neither officer answered. They didn't have to. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. He had led missions behind enemy lines, negotiated with warlords, dismantled insurgent networks with surgical precision. But here, in his own country, his own mother had been treated like a criminal for daring to walk home with a bag of groceries. He wasn't just angry. He was ready for war. This isn't over, Elijah said, voice deadly calm, not by a long shot. He turned back to his mother, shielding her with his body as if his mere presence could ward off the broken system that had almost stolen her life. Outside, cameras flashed. Inside, a son prepared for battle, not on foreign soil, but against the sickness rotting his own homeland. Before we continue, let's take a short pause. If you're listening to our story, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from and if you've ever experienced or witnessed anything similar. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapters. Now, let's continue. Elijah sat stiffly in the cold plastic chair outside the ICU, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed low. The hospital corridor buzzed with the muted chaos of tragedy, weeping relatives, anxious doctors, the occasional shrill beep of machinery fighting to hold someone in the realm of the living. Hours had passed since he first arrived, but Elijah hadn't moved. He stayed rooted there, guarding the door to his mother's room like a soldier guarding a battlefield fallen silent after a brutal fight. Across from him, 2 officers still lingered, pretending not to watch him but failing miserably. Every now and then, one would whisper to the other, stealing glances like children too afraid to face the truth of what they had done. Elijah didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He could feel the fear radiating off them like heat waves from burning asphalt. The news was already spreading. On every TV mounted on the hospital walls, his mother's face flashed beneath sensationalist headlines. Woman shot by police, mistaken identity, community demands answers after elderly black woman gunned down. Every channel paraded the same blurry footage, Marlene crumpling to the ground, groceries spilling across the pavement like a life interrupted. No apology. No accountability. Just footage and speculation. Before we continue, let's take a short pause. If you're listening to our story, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from and if you've ever experienced or witnessed anything similar. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapters. Now, let's continue. Antes de seguir, hagamos una pequeña pausa. Si estás escuchando nuestra historia, nos encantaría saber de ti. Cuéntanos en los comentarios desde donde nos escuchas y si alguna vez has vivido o presenciado algo similar. No olvides suscribir para no perder los próximos capítulos. Ahora, seguimos. The anger inside Elijah simmered dangerously. He rose slowly, his back straight, his fists unclenching with deliberate control. He crossed the hallway to where the 2 officers stiffened at his approach. Who gave the order? Elijah asked, voice low, heavy. The officers exchanged a quick, nervous glance. We, Can't comment on an ongoing investigation, sir. Elijah smiled. But it was a cold, dead thing. Understand something. I'm not the media. I'm not here to listen to official statements. He took a step closer, towering over them. I've led Black Ops missions in war zones you've only seen in nightmares. I know what cover-ups look like. And I know what cowards smell like. Neither officer met his eyes. You want to play games? Elijah said. Fine. But when the world finds out what really happened here, it won't just be your badges you'll lose. He turned and walked away, leaving the weight of his words to crush them where they stood. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. It was Marcus, an old friend from his Delta days, now a lawyer specializing in civil rights abuses. You need to come down to my office, Marcus said without preamble. Now, it's already started. Elijah's stomach twisted. He didn't have to ask what it was. The smear campaign. Sure enough, as Elijah scrolled through his notifications, he saw them. Anonymous sources leaking lies. Fake witnesses claiming Marlene had been aggressive. Political commentators spinning the narrative, trying to paint her as someone who somehow deserved to be gunned down. It was the oldest tactic in the book. Dehumanize the victim. Discredit the family. Protect the system. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, drawing a slow, steady breath. He remembered Marlene's laughter filling their small kitchen, her hand strong yet gentle as she taught him how to tie his first tie before his high school graduation. They could spin all the lies they wanted. He knew the truth. And now, he would fight to make sure the world knew it too. The streets were filled with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Elijah could feel it as he sat in Marcus's office, the low hum of the fluorescent lights above, the slight buzz of anticipation in the air. The city was holding its breath. It was only a matter of time before the spark would ignite the powder keg of anger that had been simmering for years. Marcus's office was a sanctuary of sorts, clean, professional, but with an unmistakable edge that reflected his years in civil rights law. A single black and white photograph of Martin Luther King Jr. hung above the desk, his face frozen in a moment of quiet determination. Let's talk strategy, Marcus said, breaking the silence. Elijah's jaw tightened. He'd spent the last several hours in shock, in disbelief, trying to process what had happened to his mother. But now, it was time for action. He wasn't going to let this die like so many others had. First, Marcus continued, we need to get ahead of the narrative. The media is already spinning lies. We can't afford to play defense. Elijah nodded. The smear campaign against his mother had already begun. They were painting her as a threat, a criminal, as if the fact that she was black gave them permission to take her life without consequence. Elijah clenched his fists. You have a plan for this? Elijah's voice was low, but sharp. Marcus leaned forward. I've already contacted some key journalists. We need to expose everything, the truth, the history of abuse, the culture of impunity within the police force. But we also need to hit them where it hurts, public opinion. A knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Marcus's secretary entered, holding a stack of papers. Here's the latest press release, she said, handing it to Marcus, and some other documents I think you'll want to see. Marcus flipped through the pages quickly, his expression hardening with every word. They're already twisting the narrative, he muttered, claiming your mother was carrying a weapon. That's the defense they're going with. Elijah's blood ran cold. A weapon? His voice cracked with disbelief. She was holding groceries. Marcus slammed the papers down onto the desk. They'll do whatever it takes. They're trying to turn her into a criminal to justify what they did. But we'll fight this. We're going to take this to the streets if we have to. Elijah felt the heat rising inside him again. The anger that had simmered in his chest ever since he heard those first words from the nurse. Critical condition. Gunshot wound. The world had failed his mother, and now he would make them all see the truth. But then, something unexpected happened. The door opened again, and a man stepped in. Elijah didn't recognize him at first. He was older, wearing a well-tailored suit, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, knowing. Who are you? Elijah asked, his tone immediate and suspicious. The man didn't flinch. My name's Jason Taylor. I'm with the Department of Justice. The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. Department of Justice. The kind of connection that could make or break everything. Taylor stepped forward. I've been tracking the case. The narrative is already being twisted, and I can tell you right now that if you don't act fast, it's going to be buried. I'm here to help you, but we need to move quickly. Elijah studied him, his mind racing. He didn't trust easily, especially not now, when everything felt like it was falling apart. But there was something in Taylor's demeanor, something that felt different from the usual corporate politicking and self-serving actions he had seen before. He wanted to believe him. Why now? Elijah asked, voice skeptical. Why get involved? Taylor's eyes met his, unflinching. Because I've seen this before, and I know how it ends. But this time, we're going to change that. A silence filled the room, thick with the weight of what was at stake. How? Elijah asked, after what felt like an eternity. Taylor smiled, a small, knowing smile. We go public. We put the truth in front of the people. We bring in the witnesses, the medical reports, the video footage. We fight for every inch of ground they've stolen from you and your family. The plan was in motion. Elijah could feel it, the sharp, undeniable clarity of purpose cutting through the haze of grief and anger. The world would not silence his mother's story, and neither would he. The protest was more than just a gathering. It was an eruption of frustration, a release of pent-up rage that had been simmering for too long. The streets around the courthouse were packed with people, black men and women, young and old, allies who stood beside them, shouting for justice. The air was thick with chants, fists raised, signs waving. Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest, watching the storm unfold. It had been days since Marcus and the DOJ had come together to strategize. The plan was simple: make sure the truth reached the people, expose the police force for the corrupt institution it was. But the truth was always harder to swallow than the lies, especially when those lies were designed to protect the very system that had taken his mother's life. Elijah could feel the pressure building in his chest. There was something heavy in the air, something that felt like the tipping point. They had done everything right, contacted the press, leaked the footage, reached out to every major outlet, but the system wasn't about to roll over quietly. Justice is what we seek, the chant echoed around him, reverberating off the courthouse steps. Elijah's fingers clenched at his sides, his anger boiling over. His mother had been shot in cold blood, and yet the media was still playing defense for the police. Every headline, every news outlet tried to soften the blow, downplaying the violence. But this time, Elijah wouldn't allow it. He stepped forward into the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of people. There were so many faces, so many angry, determined faces, but he could see it in their eyes. They were waiting for something. They needed a spark, something to turn the tide. Now is the time, Elijah muttered to himself. Now is when we take it all back. As if in response to his words, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the flash of bright lights. Elijah turned, instinctively shielding his eyes from the glare. The police had arrived. Riot gear gleamed under the harsh lights, and officers lined the streets, blocking off any exit. The tension in the crowd shifted from anger to fear. Then the first shot rang out. It was chaos. People screamed and scattered, pushing and shoving to get away. Elijah's heart raced as he grabbed Marcus, pulling him toward a nearby alley. The air was thick with the scent of tear gas, the sound of sirens blaring, the heavy footsteps of armored police marching down the street. He could hear the shouts, the commotion, but he could not see through the smoke. Get to cover, Marcus shouted, but Elijah wasn't listening. He couldn't, not with his mother's life still hanging in the balance. Elijah reached for his phone, his hands shaking. He needed to get the truth out. He needed the world to see what was happening. He needed to make them all hear his mother's name. A message came through from Taylor. It's about to get ugly. Hold fast. Elijah's fingers hovered over the screen, then quickly typed a reply. It's already ugly. He turned back toward the chaos, determined to stay in the fight. This was no longer just about his mother. It was about the entire community that had been silenced for too long. It was about a system that needed to be brought to its knees. As he stepped forward, a voice rose above the commotion. It wasn't a protest chant or a shout of anger. It was a cry for help, raw and desperate. Elijah stopped dead in his tracks. The voice came from a woman, a black woman, who was standing near the front of the protest line. She had been caught in the middle of the street, a group of officers closing in on her. Help me, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. I didn't do anything. Before Elijah could react, he saw the officers advance. They pushed her to the ground with brutal force. Something inside him snapped. He didn't think, he just moved. He pushed through the crowd, the heat of rage propelling him forward. He reached the woman just as the officers were about to cuff her. Without thinking, he grabbed the nearest officer, pulling him away from the woman. His hands were tied around the officer's collar, his eyes blazing with fury. Get your hands off her, Elijah yelled. She hasn't done a damn thing. The officer froze, his face pale with shock. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the chaos of the crowd fading into the background. The officer looked into Elijah's eyes, recognizing the man who had been leading the charge in the media. Then, something shifted. The officer's hand moved to his gun. Elijah's heart raced. He knew what was coming, but this time, he wasn't backing down. Not this time. The sound of sirens was deafening, a constant, pulsing reminder that the chaos had only just begun. Elijah could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, a mix of fear and adrenaline surging through his veins. The officer's hand was still hovering over his gun, and Elijah didn't hesitate. His instincts took over. In one swift movement, he grabbed the officer's wrist, twisting it away from the weapon, slamming the man's arm against the concrete. The officer gasped, momentarily stunned by the suddenness of the action. Elijah's breath came in ragged bursts, his muscles coiled tight, ready for anything. "What the hell are you doing?" the officer barked, his voice shaky but full of anger. "I'm doing what you should have done a long time ago," Elijah replied, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm fighting for my mother, for everyone like her who's been wronged." The officer's face turned pale, his lips trembling as he tried to gather his bearings. The crowd was still surging around them, the riot police pushing forward, but for a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed. Elijah stared into the officer's eyes, seeing not just fear but something darker, guilt, maybe, or shame. He had seen it in others before, that moment when someone realized the line they had crossed couldn't be erased. But Elijah knew this was no time for hesitation. He shoved the officer to the ground and took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The officer scrambled to his feet, eyes wide with panic, but Elijah didn't give him the chance to make a move. He turned, pulling Marcus with him, heading deeper into the alleyways. They needed to get out of the open. The streets were becoming a war zone. "Move, Marcus," Elijah said, his voice cold with determination. Marcus, breathing heavily, glanced back at the chaos that had erupted. "We can't just leave them out there," he said, his voice strained. "We don't have a choice," Elijah said, not looking back. "We have to stay alive if we're going to finish this fight." They pushed through the alley, the sounds of distant gunfire and screams fading into the background. The protest had turned into something unrecognizable, a war zone of its own. Elijah had expected resistance, but not this level of violence. His mind raced, thinking of his next move, of how they could continue to push for justice without getting swallowed by the system that was doing everything it could to silence them. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Taylor. "The news is all over it. This is bigger than we thought. Stay safe." Elijah read the message twice, the weight of it sinking in. It was true, what had started as a local issue was now a national conversation. The world was watching. But was that enough? Was it enough for the lives lost? For the blood spilled in the streets? He didn't know. But what he did know was that they couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close to revealing the truth. Not when so many people were counting on them. "Where to now?" Marcus asked, breaking Elijah from his thoughts. "We hit the safe house," Elijah replied, his tone grim. "Lay low for a while, but keep the pressure up. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." And as they disappeared into the shadows, the fight for justice was far from over. Elijah had made a promise to his mother and to every other life that had been stolen by the system. It was a promise he would keep, no matter the cost. The silence after the chaos was suffocating. Elijah stood alone in the darkened room of the safe house, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, each more urgent than the last. The sounds of the outside world, the distant roar of helicopters, the whine of sirens, seemed distant, as if they were part of another reality. Inside, though, in this small, dimly lit room, the weight of everything that had happened felt unbearable. He was supposed to feel relief. They were safe, for now, but all Elijah felt was the cold, suffocating presence of guilt. His hands were still shaking from the moments earlier, from the way he'd acted in the heat of the moment. He had acted out of instinct, and yet, it didn't feel like enough. It never felt like enough. "I should have done more," he muttered to himself, pacing the floor. Marcus watched him from across the room, his face unreadable, eyes tired but sharp. They hadn't spoken much since they'd made it to the safe house, but Marcus didn't need to say anything. Elijah could feel the weight of his friend's silence. Marcus knew the fight they were in was far from over. "How long do we keep running?" Marcus asked, his voice low, but edged with concern. Elijah stopped pacing, his hand resting on the edge of the table. He looked up at Marcus, meeting his eyes, his face tight with determination. "We don't," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "We keep pushing. We keep fighting. It's not just about my mother anymore. It's about all of them, the ones who've suffered, the ones who never had a voice. We can't stop. Not now." Marcus nodded, understanding, but the fear still lingered, like a shadow in the corner of the room. The truth was, they didn't know how much longer they could stay in the shadows, how long they could keep avoiding the inevitable. Elijah turned to the window, looking out at the dimly lit street below. The world had changed overnight. The protests had gone global, the story of his mother's murder reverberating through every news outlet, every social media platform. But there was something darker behind the scenes that most people didn't see, the forces that were working tirelessly to bury the truth, to silence them before they could speak. He knew it wasn't just the police they were up against. It was the system itself, the one that had allowed his mother's death to go unpunished, the one that had allowed violence like this to continue unchecked for far too long. "I'm not running anymore," Elijah said, his voice a whisper but full of fire. "We're going to tear this down, piece by piece." He turned back to face Marcus. His friend's eyes were filled with a quiet resolve. Elijah could see the exhaustion in Marcus's face, but there was no doubt in his mind. They were in this together. They had to be. The sun had long since set, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the night was just beginning. He and Marcus had spent the last few hours going over every detail, every plan they could think of. The safe house was silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the sound of distant sirens, reminders of the war zone they were living in. The last few weeks had been a blur. What started as a small protest had become a tidal wave of outrage. Every news outlet, every street corner, every corner of the internet had turned its gaze to Elijah and his mother's death. His face had become a symbol of resistance, but it felt hollow to him. The battle was not over. "What do we do next?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Elijah paused. He stood at the window, watching the faint glow of streetlights from the safe house. He wasn't sure what the next step would be. But he knew one thing, it was time to strike back. No more running, no more hiding. This was it. We'll pause here for a moment. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and if you've experienced something similar in your life. Don't forget to subscribe to keep following this journey. "We're going to finish what we started," Elijah said, turning to face Marcus. "We're going to make sure everyone hears the truth, no matter how much they try to bury it. We're going to keep fighting until the system that killed my mother is torn apart." Marcus nodded, a grim look on his face. They both knew that what they were about to do was dangerous. They were going to confront the people who had been hiding the truth, who had been covering up the injustice. But Elijah wasn't afraid anymore. If anything, he was more determined than ever to expose everything, to bring it all to light. That night, Elijah went to sleep with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't sleep long, though. The sound of helicopters filled the air as the sun began to rise. The city was still in turmoil. But there was something else in the air now, a sense of urgency. Elijah knew this was it. The world was waiting for him to act. The next morning, the media storm had escalated. Elijah's name was on every screen. People were marching in the streets, chanting his name, demanding justice. But it wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about all the victims who had never had their stories told. The government was scrambling. They were afraid. They knew that the more Elijah spoke out, the more the truth would come to light. But Elijah had nothing left to lose. He had already lost everything, his mother, his peace of mind, his future. There was no going back now. Elijah took to the streets, leading the charge. The crowd was massive, their voices rising in unison. "Justice for the fallen," they screamed. No more silence. The message was clear. They were done being quiet, done being oppressed. They would not back down until the system was held accountable. But as they marched through the streets, Elijah could see something in the distance, a line of black SUVs, with tinted windows, pulling up in front of the crowd. Elijah's heart raced. He knew who was inside those vehicles, the very people who had been pulling the strings, who had been keeping the truth buried. The crowd began to chant louder, a wave of defiance rising through the air. Elijah felt the energy surge in his chest. This was it, the final confrontation, the reckoning. As the SUVs stopped, the doors opened, and a group of heavily armed men stepped out, dressed in tactical gear. Elijah's pulse quickened, but he didn't falter. He stepped forward, his voice booming over the crowd. "We will not be silenced," he shouted. "We will not be intimidated." For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The tension in the air was palpable, and Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this was the moment that would define everything.